Great. Okay. So I think we've had a wonderful day so far, and I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce you to our closing panelists. This panel, as Ed mentioned, will be focusing on regulatory issues, questions of enforcement and policy making. And I think we've been able to get a really incredible group together. So from my far left, we have Ed Felton, who, as you know at this point, is a professor here in computer science in the public affairs school, and also the director of the Center for Information Technology and Policy. He's also served as the chief technologist at the FTC, in fact, the first chief technologist at the FTC. To his right is Ashkan Soltani, who is an independent security researcher and consultant who is widely known for his work both with Julia Angwin and her team at the Wall Street Journal and more recent work at the Wall Street Journal, and who was just recently named and announced as the incoming chief technologist of the FTC. To his right is Jeannie Barton, who is the vice president and director of online behavioral advertising program and mobile marketing initiatives at the Council of Better Business Bureaus. Her responsibilities include administering the self-regulatory program for online behavioral advertising. And to her right is Paul Ohm, professor and associate dean at the University of Colorado Law School at Boulder, who also at some point served as senior policy advisor at the FTC. So we have a really amazing group of people here who have lots of experience working on regulatory issues in practice. And so I thought, just to kind of get started, I'd go down the panel and ask for some really, general impressions of the day, and we'll get further and further into the technicals. But I wonder, just as a kind of starting point, what does this mean for policy? What can we draw from this when thinking about regulatory issues? And Paul, you asked. Okay, so why don't we start with you, Ed, and I'll move down that line that way.
Okay, so we've seen today a bunch of discussion of different kinds of tools and methods coming out of the computer science community that can increase transparency and shed light on practices related to data collection and personalization. And I think one of the lessons from this is that this community is maturing and is now generating data and observations that are potentially very useful in policymaking, both in informing policy decisions, but also in helping along the application of policy and the enforcement of the law. These tools, I already know from the time I spent at the FTC, even a couple of years ago, were useful in policymaking and law enforcement. But what I've heard about today is pretty far beyond what existed even when I was in government. And I can tell you, I sure wish that I had had some of these tools available when I was there.
Okay. So I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm not at the FTC, nor are my views anything indicative of the views of the FTC or the Commission. I'm going to get used to saying that. So today was a great example of both the technical kind of sophistication and complexity required to understand some of the kind of underlying algorithms and processes that are responsible for the ad targeting, tracking, kind of privacy features, and kind of services that we all interact with, as well as the kind of the difficulty in mapping those kind of complexities to policy. And figuring out where the lines are and where the gray areas are. Traditionally, a lot of the inferences and that were being made could often be correlated or subpoenaed or easily, emails could be read or companies could be reviewed. In this case, when it comes to large-scale algorithmic inferences, it's become much more difficult to correlate or find causation to the point where we can find clear kind of liability or wrongdoing. And I think as we kind of move forward, a lot of the thinking needs to be and it clearly is from the discussion today, needs to be not only on the technical ways to detect and measure these things, but trying to figure out ways to define what those boundaries are and where those lines are, as everyone's trying to come up with ways to to develop these technologies and to provide, good features for consumers as well as sometimes not so favorable practices.
I think that I agree with the former chief technologist and the to-be chief technologist on surprisingly every point they have made. And my views here are also entirely my own and don't represent what I will do to enforce a certain circumscribed set of principles, which is my job responsibility. I have to start by just telling you I'm amazed to be back here because I went to graduate school here when dinosaurs were still walking the earth, and it was doing Renaissance English, particularly Shakespeare. And I was doing that because I thought it was the most exciting time of real change in how people looked at themselves and looked at themselves in the world. And I have to tell you, I'm just as excited to be doing what I do now because I think we're at the same kind of amazing change in what and how we do. Now, with my enforcement hat on, I can't tell you I feel like a kid in the ice cream store. These are the things that I think about every day and the issues that I need to work on enforcement. And without the technologies and the research of everyone in this room, that is not possible. But I also commend the thoughtfulness and openness to not making policy or judgment determinations, but to be teasing out what those hard questions are that has gone on today. And I think that remains a very large problem, but that we are now discussing real issues of moment in terms of uses, discrimination, transparency, that go quite a bit beyond, as I agree with Ashkan, where we were 2 years ago, not only in our technological sophistication, but in our policy sophistication in what question should we be asking.
So thanks for having me out here. It's always a pleasure. Let me just say like 3 things by way of introduction. So number one, the reason I value CITP so much is because this is one of the rare venues where technologists and policy and law kind of all speak the same language, and today was such a good example of that. I appreciate the computer scientists who kind of kept out a lot of the statistical and mathematical proof slides that you probably have when you present this work in other audiences, but it's because of that that I think this is a fine exemplar for how you talk across the transom, and especially for the kind of younger graduate students and undergrads in the room. If you're here at Princeton, do not waste this opportunity. Come to this center as often as you can to learn from the very best people in the nation, if not the world, on these issues. So there's my my plug for the center. Number 2, I think Julia was a really wonderful keynote in the middle of the day, because one thing that I think Ed noted on already is this really began as this kind of strange hybrid of journalism, investigative reporting, independent consulting, and a lot of other things thrown into the mix. And what I see today is a kind of more academic formalization of this work. And as my earlier question suggested, I think that's mostly for the good, but I want to make sure that it doesn't go too far, because I think sometimes formalization and rigor will make the work slower and maybe less approachable. And there is a tiny, tiny risk that it becomes so theorized that it becomes a conversation within a community instead of one that crosses boundaries. And I'm happy to say more about that later, but I think, you know, people like Ashkan and others who have always straddled the line between academics and non-academics are really what policymakers need a lot more of. They also need traditional academics acting as academics. And the last thing I'm going to say is almost at this point unnecessary, because it's been so evident. Most of us who used to call ourselves privacy scholars have realized how complexified our self-identity has become, because privacy is a concern, and it's a large concern, and it's one I'm happy to say a lot about. But it really has been joined by discrimination and discrimination defined in very, very, very broad and interesting ways as an information flow concern that's similar to privacy, but really, really different in lots of ways. And I think that's great. I mean, I think it's a trend we've seen kind of on the academic side for a number of years. It's a trend I saw in a lot of the discussions today, and it's one that, frankly, the policymakers have not even begun to tangle with. So I'll talk a little bit about where they are with that, but the level of discourse in this room was already far beyond, I think, what's happening on that very question in DC.
I thought we're policymakers.
What?
Yeah, you're a policymaker now anymore.
But you are too.
Well, you write articles, you make policy.
No, I'm talking about yes,
Regulatory.
one way to think about this is there are privacy people and there are discrimination people in DC agencies. And discrimination people, they love being called that, by the way, they're much less focused on these issues. I can talk, well, I don't want to go on and on about this, but I can talk mostly about what I've seen on the academic side. So if you go to someone who is a civil rights anti-discrimination scholar in a law school and you present some of the themes and theories that we're kicking around today, they'll say, no. We've been fighting anti-discrimination for 50 years. We know what it means. It means protected classes, and it means historically disadvantaged groups, and it means nothing else. And so if you're worried about Orbit's pricing of travel, or if you're worried about some of the things that were shown in the last panel, that's not anti-discrimination law. And oh, by the way, we don't want you to spoil the kind of detente that we've developed in our field. I think you'll encounter this at the EEOC, and we've got people like David Robinson who can speak a little more authoritatively about this than I. But it seems to me like we're having this conversation here, but we're missing actually a big key part of the conversation, the policymakers that are different policymakers than we are.
Yeah, can I just add, I think there is a very blurring line between differentiation and discrimination, particularly in this environment. There have been times, and I am by no means a civil rights scholar. I know almost nothing about it, to my shame. But there have been ideas of redlining, which were, I think, fairly revolutionary in their time. There are now proxies for things online that you could perhaps characterize as a kind of online redlining. There is traditional advertising law, which has always distinguished between an offer and an eligibility determination. But I think where we are now is wondering if that line is always clear, and where do we define discrimination and where do we define differentiation in the online world, and how do we apply legal analyses to those things that are clearly in the jurisprudence discrimination or protected classes, where we see novel uses or results from the environment in which we're working.
So this is great, and I actually definitely want to come back to this more. But for the first more practical question, I actually want to know concretely what kinds of evidence could be generated that would be actionable already. So in the kind of experiences that you've had at these agencies, what can researchers be generating that would actually lead to immediate enforcement actions? And anyone can start.
Okay, well, let me talk a little based on my experience at the FTC, where I worked on a number of enforcement actions, and some of them were, some of them used information or tools that came from the academic community. For the most part, the details of particular investigations are behind the veil, but I can speak in some generalities. One is that there were certainly instances where there was an academic study or paper showing that a particular practice happened that looked to us initially like it might be a violation of the law. When that happened, we would sometimes, if we could quickly replicate the measurement, we would do that. or if we could get data from an academic researcher and the data was such that it was forensically adequate, let's say, then we could go ahead right away from that. So that was that would really be an instance where the idea that a particular kind of violation was going on came from a researcher.
And just to clarify, this is like a violation which is in clear contravention of the privacy policy.
Or something that looked like a violation of the FTC Act. And one way something could be in violation of the FTC Act is if the company made a representation in their privacy policy that we are not doing X or we are doing Y, and then their behavior was contradictory to that. That would, generally speaking, be a deceptive practice under the FTC Act. So if somebody pointed to a practice that looked like a violation, we could certainly jump on that quickly. But the other situation that did come up was cases where where things didn't arise quite that way, and we generated a lead and evidence in a different way, and used tools from academic researchers. Certainly, I can say that I did go out and download and use tools that came out of the research community. In order to investigate, to look to see whether there was an issue, and then to gather the forensic data that we needed in order to proceed with an enforcement. So that was very, very useful. I also found it useful often just to talk to people in the research community about what they were studying. There was a new study that shows that practice X happens much more than we had thought, practice Y happens much less, and those sorts of things would also influence decisions about where to investigate or what to do on the policy side.
I mean, one thing I would add, the less savory side of this, maybe, depending on your point of view. So Ed describes the well-ordered enforcement mechanism of an administrative agency. There are also, in the patchwork of American privacy law, provisions that allow for civil lawsuits and often allow for plaintiffs' class action lawsuits. And so insofar as any of this conduct, the kind of conduct discussed, either violates one of these statutes or can be argued by a clever lawyer to violate these statutes, there's an alternative method of enforcement. And despite all the kind of funny asides and caveats, I actually think often a socially productive form of enforcement. So to be a little more concrete, lawsuits have been brought under the Video Privacy Protection Act, they've been brought under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Stored Communications Act, and my personal favorite, the Wiretap Act. The Wiretap Act is a fascinating statute that talks about obtaining content from people, intercepting it. And some of the practices that were described today maybe can edge close to what could be arguably wiretap. Here's two things about the Wiretap Act you may not know that make it particularly appealing to the plaintiffs' bar. Number one, wiretap, and a lot of people don't realize this, has a very, very, very vigorous definition of consent. And I think there's lots of arguments that clicking I agree on in terms of service, although it'll put you in the clear for lots of statutes, won't put you in the clear for the Wiretap Act. Courts have held, for example, that prisoners in prison do not consent to being recorded on the telephone when they talk to, the person across the window, unless there's a sign on the phone that says, "We are recording you." So clearly it's not just, hey, you should know better, you're a prisoner, you've got no privacy. There's actually a meaningful consent model. The second reason why the Wiretap Act is so potent is it allows for $100 per day per victim, or $10,000, without the necessity of proof. And so Google now, in 2 high-profile cases, have been sued under the Wiretap Act, in which they've intercepted the communications of tens of millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of people. So multiply that times 10,000 to see the bill they're facing. Unlike the numbers Julia talked about earlier, this is the kind of dollar figure that keeps Google's lawyers up at night. And so again, less orderly, more chaotic, and frankly, the plaintiff's bar doesn't care if you've got statistically rigorous results as long as you explain it in a really nice blog post that they can cut and paste into their complaint, but it could have a nice societal forcing effect as well.
Now, I remain sad that no one has mentioned self-regulation, since that's what I do. And I know that would be your favorite keys to enforce that. But self-regulation is not without teeth. I've got them, and I'm not afraid to use them. And self-regulation can use your data. For example, one thing that I enforce is the prohibition that is just modeled on statute against using multi-site data, that is, data collected across sites, to make an eligibility determination about something that really matters, like insurance decisions, health decisions, where educational decisions, hiring decisions. I am looking for evidence that I can use that a company has been doing this in contravention of our requirements. And I am seeing glimmers in what I'm seeing here of potential for doing that. The other thing, and I've looked at it with great interest and have corresponded with people in this room, is the cookieless ID study that came out of Princeton and Belgium. This is an area that I had already done some work in and issued a decision. I was excited because there was now a web crawler, a mechanism by which I could more rigorously look for this kind of behavior. The principles I enforce say if you are going to collect data for online behavioral advertising, you've got to be transparent about it. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about whether these principles go far enough. I am simply here to tell you what exists that I enforce and what I am interested in from that perspective, and then to give my own opinions further than that. But these are already tools that self-regulation, they're things, tangible behaviors that self-regulation can reach, and where industry has pledged not to do certain things. And it is the technologists who will provide the tools for bringing enforcement actions, and those companies whose behavior is good versus those companies that are skirting or pushing the edge of the envelope in these ways should be differentiated, and differentiated in a public way.
So I have maybe two follow-up questions here, and one is to kind of ask a kind of political economy question, which is, why is this happening in the academy, and why is this not happening among these organizations themselves or within the regulatory bodies? And what does this kind of say about the incentive structures or other kinds of political structures which are producing this kind of pattern? And given, though, that there are now possibly these tools for various kinds of regulators, including self-regulatory bodies, to use, does it actually mean that certain ways of regulating that we previously perceived as ineffective could become effective, right? Could self-regulation now have teeth and a degree of effective accountability that it might not have had in the past? Where can this kind of go? How does this change what we perceive as the efficacy of existing regulatory strategies?
I'll go again. One of the reasons why you see this happening more in the academic world than in a place like, say, the FTC is the number of people who are trained and able to do the work who are at these places. There's certainly a lot more in the academic world, and they're more inclined to publish what they do. When I did some of this while I was at the FTC, and much of what I did not become public and would not, because that's not the nature, that's not the goal. The goal is not to publish what we were able to, information about what we were able to achieve technically in a way that would be useful to others. In fact, to the extent that we're doing investigations, we don't want to talk about what we can do, and sometimes strategically there's some benefit for those, for potential lawbreakers to be uncertain about what our capabilities are. So I think that's certainly part of it. There are also inherent difficulties with doing innovative things within government that have to do, I think, less with attitudes and more with some of the challenges that you face that relate to budgets and the difficulties of changing personnel allocations and all of those sorts of institutional features. But that's a much different discussion, why it's hard to do things in government.
And I think that's a great question, if only for, understanding or trying to improve the efficacy or efficiency of kind of both regulation and self-regulation. And one of the things Paul and I have been kicking around, or I've been kicking around with Paul, and I have to figure out how to kind of, whether I can write this or how to write this or formulate this. But one idea which a lot of the technical community is familiar with is this idea of a kind of a unit test or a test harness, right? So when you develop software, you typically run tests or create tests that incrementally, as you make changes to the software, will test functionality of the software such that there's particular outcomes ensured, right? So if you're, if you have a thermometer and it's supposed to kind of show red when there's boiling water, every time you modify it, the unit test would still ensure that the thermometer would show red when the water is boiling. And one idea from a kind of a self-regulatory perspective would be whether companies that create algorithms, whether the people that are enabling and creating the algorithms could themselves employ some of the statistical methods and tests that we've described here today themselves for specific types of practices that we generally think as unfair, and somewhat assure or ensure that their software within some statistical probability does not cross those lines, whether it's racial kind of racial or gender or particular kind of eligibility decisions based on that data. And so the question would be, what would be those principles? You wouldn't want to specifically be too you wouldn't want to be too specific as to what the exact kind of thresholds are, but you would want to kind of have guidance such that the companies themselves creating these algorithms, and as we've discussed, sometimes a lot of folks may not know their particular outcomes of their algorithms, could at least unit test to see that they don't cross certain lines and kind of make representations or make claims that, in fact, we've tested our software, we don't believe that there's racially biased search results or there's gender disparity with job ads. And if that's the case, you might find that a lot of the black boxing that we have to do from the outside as regulators or academics, trying to figure out how the hell things work, it might be better from someone on the inside that has still some idea of how their system's architected to do these things themselves. In the same way that you would find a security audit or some sort of self-proclaimed kind of audit of their own system for other technical means.
If I could just interject something to follow up on that. I think one of the things that you see is that the companies that in general, there's a correlation between a company violating the law in this area and that company being overconfident about how well they understand what their own product is doing. And therefore, approaches that ask companies to look self-critically at what they're doing will be most effective for those companies that are least likely to break the law in the first place.
Okay, I'd like to add from my perspective, first of all, what Ed said about resource limitation. Whatever resource limitation the FTC has, I've got more. I have sought collaboration, and I continue to seek, this is a commercial, collaboration with researchers, where you have sophistication, graduate students, and time. I don't have as much of that as you do, and I would be very, very grateful for your help. Also, if any of you want a year's fellowship with us, we would be just thrilled. So I'm really glad to be here so that you can see that we exist, that we are sincere, in our desire to make things better, and that we could truly use your help.
So my quick answer to that question is, I wonder if we're being a tad bit impatient. Arvin said at the very start of the day, a couple of years ago, there weren't a lot of academics doing this. The tracking ecosystem on the other side has been rapidly evolving and looks nothing like it did a decade ago. And so it may be that government agencies learn how to do this. I think about Kristen Slater and Winona Ryder in Pump Up the Volume, right, where they're running away from the FCC truck that's trying to track them down. That's a documentary, by the way. But I also think about agencies like the NHTSA and the FDA, and there are examples of expert government agencies that have embraced science and scientific methods in their investigations. And frankly, there's the FBI. So before my current life, I was a Justice Department prosecutor, and although the FBI doesn't approach what you'll see on Homeland or one of these other shows, they use fairly sophisticated technologies as part of their investigations. I would love to see a day where the FTC has a Bureau of Technology, just like today they have a Bureau of Economics, and it's headed by people like Ashkan and Ed, and they have an army of investigators that are replicating a lot of the work that you guys are the vanguard of. So let's give it 5 years. It might happen. It'll take a lot of political will and some change, but I think it could happen.
So I'll just say that it seems like the past maybe 5 years or so, there's kind of been this pipeline of academic researchers, some of whom here are in the room, doing some kind of research which gets picked up by a regulatory body or by lawyers who bring class action lawsuits. This has kind of become something of a common pattern. Is the kind of plan then to try to formalize this? Like, is it to make this something that doesn't actually require this ad hoc assembly of people where like researchers are independently burdened to do that work to make it possible to keep this going? Is there a way to make this something that's actually kind of more cohesive, more institutionalized?
Well, until they open FTC labs. Let me endorse Paul's proposal here that the FTC have a permanent staff in this area that can stay on top of these things to a greater extent. Until that happens, I think you have external researchers, and it's really more the case that the policy value of some of this research is a side effect of the research rather than necessarily the immediate goal, right? Researchers are trying to produce results that will have impact in their field, that will be publishable and so on. And to the extent that along the way they find something of enforcement or policymaking value, that's a good thing. Those who are public spirited, and there are quite a few of them, including many of the folks here in the room, will take time to increase the policy impact of what they're doing. But we have to recognize that from the standpoint of the professional incentives of these people within the research community, that there are sacrifices being made in order to connect to the policy world. So that, I think, is also not a model that's strong enough to pull the train.
Now, I'll be blunt. If someone can publish an article and see the fruits of their work help them in their careers, or quietly come to me and tell me something, I don't blame them for choosing the former and not the latter. Where I am hoping for closer collaborations is when I have a problem being able to talk more and draw on the expertise of people in the technology arena, because they might have a little bit more understanding of what I'm trying to do and a little bit more tolerance of the limitations under which I operate.
And I think one of the other kind of secondary effects of this research or these processes are essentially the awareness or almost chilling effect in terms of knowing there are people watching, right? That there are researchers and regulators and self-regulatory bodies that are able to understand and disassemble and kind of infer what is occurring under the hood by these new technologies. And as Ed said earlier, the FTC kind of tends to hold closely its capabilities and what its abilities are in terms of enforcement action, or what it's able to, or its techniques with regards to enforcement. And having a community of people that are constantly pushing the envelope in terms of what they can detect and what they can bring to light, and essentially reverse engineer about potentially bad practices, I think helps not only in bringing enforcement action, but also limiting the counterforce to this, which is pushing the envelope with new tracking or new privacy invasive practices.
I mean, the one thing I want to add, because I know some of you in the audience want to throttle us, I just looked it up on Wikipedia, and it turns out there are other governments in the world other than the federal government of the US. And so it could be a really enterprising state attorney general's office that decides to get a huge influx of money to set up this lab, and because the internet is distributed across the nation, that one office could do all of the investigation that isn't happening right now at the FTC. It could be a European country that decides to do this. So there are lots of other avenues. We're obviously a little FTC-centric up here.
Yeah. And we do have the...
Yeah, the New Jersey AG.
And they've done a number of privacy
Yes,
cases.
and California is certainly not inconsiderable in its efforts.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me now try to turn actually to like more substantive questions about regulation. So, a fair amount of the discussion today actually seemed to hinge on consent and the lack of consent, and that the problem here was that there was insufficient transparency and that people hadn't really agreed to things. But if we actually think about many of the practices that are being monitored here or kind of measured, it's not a violation of the privacy policy. They actually aren't doing something that is particularly actionable, and it's not that the issue here is that they haven't given consent. In fact, they often have. Does this then suggest that like the existing frameworks or the fair information practice principles, which really kind of foundationally rely on consent as its most essential feature, are not really up for the task of the kinds of practices that are being exposed here? Does it actually suggest the need for new kinds of regulations, a different approach to regulation?
Yes. I mean, in your question, you move quickly from consent to privacy policy to fair information practices, and that's really three different things. I mean, if we lived in a world of true and meaningful consent, then I think that would be a world where we would have a lot more awareness of what's going on, where Julia might have other options than the Faraday bag for her phone. And you know, one side note of this that I was talking to Ashkan about earlier is, isn't it ironic that your phone tries to get you to turn on location services 19 times a day until the day you say yes, and then they never once ask you if you want to turn it off? And so, you know, it's with this background of fundamentally broken ideas of what we mean when we talk about consent, layered on top of a very strange legal and regulatory system that valorizes things like terms of service. Yes, that model is fundamentally broken. I think you'll find, you know, 99% of the people who write about privacy who agree with it. And then the question is, what do you replace it with?
Okay, so let me add.
Yeah.
Let me make this.
That's my bottom line.
So
Yes.
let me make this slightly more controversial
Okay.
then, because there is this ongoing debate now among people who are really in favor of abandoning a kind of collection-focused regulation and moving to a use-based regulation, focusing specifically on harmful or otherwise objectionable uses. And there's now interesting back and forth, and I wonder where some of this work might fit in that debate. Whose argument is it actually? Whose argument is being supported by some of this evidence? How does it kind of enter in there?
Okay.
Anyone?
All right. I guess I'd say a couple things about this. One of the reasons why the current framework has trouble in affecting practice, let's say, is that it's based on, I think, a fundamentally broken model of information and a fundamentally obsolete understanding of how data is collected and used. We see this in the notions of personally identifiable information and the idea that identification or re-identification is the threat. This really goes back to an assumption about an assumption that databases are organized in a particular way, that there is a single digital dossier for each person that lives in one place, and that the identifying information is the key. To talk in the language of computer science, that the database key is identity. right? But that's not the way we collect data anymore. That's not the way we organize databases anymore, and that's not the way people analyze data anymore. And the result is that we're trying to prevent from happening a thing which doesn't happen all that much anymore. Whereas most of the types of aggressive uses of, many of the types of aggressive uses of data that, that companies and governments want to do don't fall naturally into this model of PII identification, re-identification, et cetera. And what that means is that the discourse doesn't speak to these practices very well, and the privacy policies that are stated in terms of those terms in that discourse also don't effectively provide transparency or limitations in terms of what people are doing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and this I think leads to not only controls on collection, not doing and saying what people less conversant often think they do, but also that makes it very difficult to understand the implications of uses after the fact.
Could I just add that we've been grappling with this problem because no matter what we try to do in terms of a transparency and choice model, consumers simply don't have the basic digital literacy to make an informed choice or to understand the digital world that they're now in. So we're starting an educational program that we're going to call Digital IQ. And the first thing we want to do is figure out what are people most concerned about, what are the fundamental things that they don't understand, and how can we help them learn them in manageable ways. So that's just one point. On a completely different point, and that is use-based versus collection-based. I don't think anymore that a collection-based model could cope with what we've talked about in this room. We have to look at making choices about what uses, really being, I think, much more precise about what are the uses that we define as problems, and then how do we govern those uses in intelligent ways. I don't have any of those answers, but I think the White House reports, the PCAST, the White House report, the FTC's recent work in their workshops on scoring and discrimination point to some very interesting and new ways of looking at the problems.
So I'm a big fan of this idea of measurement in not just technology, but in perception or understanding. And on two particular things Jeannie just said are of interest. One is, I wonder with the digital IQ type assessments, you could also do a kind of post-digital IQ assessment of people's understanding of privacy policies, right? As they, as your members or as individuals navigate some of these notices, both in terms of the privacy policies as well as the pop-ups and the kind of types of notification that Paul was talking about earlier, it would be great to really try to measure and see, and I know CMU and Lori Kramer and a number of others do this type of work, but kind of on a larger scale, what do people really think they're agreeing to and consenting to, and how has that changed over time?
That's what we want to do. We actually want to do measurement. Not, for example, we don't want to start with survey evidence of what people are concerned about. We want to start with behavioral evidence.
Sure.
And we then want to do things, measure the effectiveness of what we've done, and any change in understanding.
Exactly, and I think that's fantastic. The other kind of behavioral evidence that might be nice, that you might be uniquely positioned to request, is, for example, what percentage of consumers visit privacy policies of your members, right? Just to have an understanding of the statistics between page visits or unique visits to say a home page and the privacy portion of a website, just to know in terms of what kind of awareness are we talking about here. I think that would be a great stat in the policy debate, to really have a good insight. Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 50% of people have read the privacy policies? I know a number of people would love to know that.
Well, I'd love to know. Someone here today said between 10 and 30% of people have tried to exercise choice. 10 to 30% is not a very precise measurement. I would love to have much more precise and differentiated measurements of that.
Isn't that something the NII would get?
And well, I'm DA. I
know.
enforce DAA. DAA knows how many people visited their website and then how many people opted out. I don't know. I think that's valuable intelligence, and my belief is that they've published it. But I think we need far more granular data about those things than that. For all I know, NAI has that data, those data points too. And we should certainly ask Mark. Maybe if we had both sets, then it would be more useful.
I think so.
Might I float the idea that there actually is like an opportunity here for people who do different kinds of empirical work to also talk to each other? So we have a group that does empirical work on users' choices and behavior, and now we're having this kind of complementary research, which is about what the companies themselves are doing. And there's also, I think, this emerging area which is kind of studying privacy policies in a systematic way. And so to kind of bring these various measurement projects together seems promising.
Well, there's also, I mean, the one thing that I kept wanting to talk about all day, but I know wasn't the exact topic, is the economics, right? And so there's really a paucity of papers that tell us anything about the value of behavioral advertising, for example. So I wrote a very, very angry draft that the world may never see that points out there are really 2 studies that are any good, and they provide tiny, tiny little pieces of the value of behavioral advertising, and that's all we have. And yet you hear these studies cited time and time again in DC by people, by the way, who aren't just lobbyists, but who are also policymakers. And so they're another part of this conversation, right? So if we ban behavioral advertising, what would the advertisers do? My guess is they'd make a ton of money. And the empirical proof suggests they would. Ads would look different than they do today, but they'd make a ton of money. And it just might be a slightly smaller ton. And so that work is completely missing kind of from the discourse, and I'd love to see more work on that too.
Well, you know what I think you could valuably do when you're not angry?
I'm not angry right now. I get angry.
I do too. But there are a few papers that have been published. One's an old one, looking at Europe after
This is Tucker.
Yeah, there are some. I think it would be valuable to see economists critique those papers and suggest where further research should be done.
No, there has. There absolutely has. I mean, the problem is the research can only happen with the data that is possessed solely by the advertisers. I don't know if any of you are clever enough from the outside to get the kind of information that you need. I know Jonathan Meir is squirming in his seat because he has written economic critiques of Tucker in particular. But it's still surprising how little these papers establish and how much they're used for.
You know, it's actually hard for any researcher, whether I don't like to say pro or con for industry, but no one wants to reveal their secret sauce or their profit margins to anyone.
But shouldn't the burden be on industry if the defense of this is the lifeblood of the economy, regulate this and you'll put everyone out of work and we'll plunge into another recession? Shouldn't the burden then be on you to...
I'm not able, don't talk that it's me.
Okay.
I am going to say that's the same thing as in law, a burden.
Sure.
Where is the burden?
I think
well, I know what you think.
The burden should be on the person making such a claim, I think, because especially if they hold the only data that...
Okay, wait, Paul. You are now you are making the assumption that this is a bad thing, and therefore the burden goes here. As a policy matter, I can see a lot of uses I would be much happier attacking first. I would also say that in discriminatory uses, I am really head up. I get mad too. I am really head up about the study of gender. I am really not happy with the fact that if a woman's name is on a resume and she and he go to a recruiter in Silicon Valley, he gets a lot more attention than she.
I'm also worried about that. I think if we as a society can tackle more than one problem at a time.
I do think that too, but I do think that there are advertising and online uses that are really pernicious. And I will say one final thing. Whoever controls the opt-in or the opt-out wins the game, and we all know that. In terms of what a consumer will do, a consumer will keep with a default setting. That's just what consumers do. Educated consumers may do something different. So I think the burden is on all of us to educate them.
Who holds the opt-out right now?
The industry, I think, holds it.
Oh, okay.
And those people who are educated can turn it to the other default. But we don't have enough educated people to do that. And I'm not about, as Dan Solow says, to be paternalistic on either direction about what consumers want or should have. I actually don't know.
So maybe we, sorry.
Okay.
You sure? So I was going to actually try to move it to discussion about, like, you know, we've had a fair amount of hand-waving today about, well, discrimination, but we're really not sure what principles to employ to make sense of that. So I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you what those principles should be, but I do want to get a sense of how you think we might go about trying to develop those principles. And what I was suggesting, I think, in the comment with the previous panel was that I think there also might be a possibility that it's not just that the legal and policy community needs to establish those independently and hand those off to researchers, but that researchers actually might be able to inform that conversation. So I wonder what some thoughts are on that.
Wait, say the last part? The researchers themselves
could
be
inform
part of the active discussion.
And to kind of figure out what those principles should be, given that the technology is doing things that are actually quite different than the way decisions were made previously.
So that's an interesting, I mean, I want to turn it around on them.
Sure.
And in case you don't know, Solon has written more about the kind of discrimination law piece of this than any of us. But it's an interesting claim that the computer scientists in particular, with their deep knowledge of how the machinery works, can also have, I don't know, a role to play in defining good and bad. It just seems like from the computer scientists I know, that seems to be a place where they get a little uncomfortable when it comes to their research, at least. Don't get me wrong, they're very opinionated as citizens, but when it comes to research.
I actually think that's exactly why this is an interesting question, because I think what we're discovering, and that kind of came up, I think, in the previous panel, is that some of the research is revealing uses for which there is no clear principled way to determine what is right or wrong, even in an intuitive sense. And I think it's not that the computer scientists should be telling the regulator what the principle should be to do that, but revealing that there is this problem, right? That there is this area where we really need to start thinking more rigorously.
So, well, let me launch on one of my standard rants now. And that is that there are ways of designing and constructing and operating these technologies which are more or less amenable to understanding and transparency. And currently the way much of this ecosystem is built is, well, I'll say it's what you would get if you were trying to design a system to be unaccountable. Meaning that you have a lot of opaque pieces, you have a lot of flows of data from here to there that are not well understood. And there are ways to change the system to make it more accountable in certain ways. There are things, for example, that products and companies could do to make it easier for them to discover if, say, discriminatory uses are occurring related to and around their product. And in general, there are tools that facilitate transparency, even transparency internally, so that the people making decisions within a company have better visibility into what their own product is doing. And I think those opportunities are often missed. And the result is, I think, harmful to companies themselves, that they have a harder time complying with their obligations, they have a harder time telling their stockholders, their directors, and their customers what it is that they do and don't do, and what the implications of their choices will be. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do better along those lines, and that arises out of the way that the technical systems are built and operated. And I think many of those opportunities are lost, and sometimes it's because of a lack of dialogue between the people who are building and operating the systems and non-technical managers.
Can I just agree with you? I have seen this, that there is a group that is doing technology that just whatever information we can glean and whatever way we can use it, great. And they don't have any insight into any sensitivities about that. Some companies are better than others in saying, yes, we get sensitive health information. It just comes to us. But before we do anything with information, we are going to discard these 17 categories. And there are companies that do that. But I also agree with you that greater transparency and greater, I would say both dialogue and pressure from the regulatory community is important to make those changes.
The one thing, I mean, Ed's comment made me think of one thing that I think I saw missing from today's slides, although I apologize if I missed it. I think by and large, a lot of the studies we saw today treated this ecosystem as a monolith. And I think, you know, one of the kind of policy questions that I often think about, and the politics questions I often think about, is this is a multi-party game between publishers and advertisers and everyone on that giant chart that we were shown at the start of the day. And I'm always wondering if this is some kind of snake oil that the middle is selling to the ends, and that the ends actually, if they knew a little bit more visibility into what was happening in the middle, would realize that the decisions aren't their own, the kind of way the revenues are flowing aren't what they understand. And I'm guessing that you're all smart enough to figure out ways to test these interfaces between the three layers. And so that's one thing that I would love to see more work out of this community. And I know there has been some on real-time bidding and things like this, but I'd like to see more of that.
Well, so if you look at that chart that everyone shows, that Arvind showed this morning, you'll notice that some of the sectors of that chart are in the business of helping one sector of the chart check up on the work of another sector of the chart.
So they're doing some.
So there's a lot of effort spent on people trying to understand, for example, helping publishers understand what is displayed to users on their own page.
Yeah.
And there's so much they don't know.
Right.
For example, Ghostery provides us free of charge with a technology platform that's walled off from their business side. But when they go and do an audit on a publisher's website, they often find like 70 cookies that the publisher was completely unaware were there. They're either scraping without being allowed, or they're left over from some former use and regime and are still there. Internally, I find when I talk to companies, there's a lot of lack of communication among different parts, silos. There's an amazing amount of ignorance. And other parts of the economy are doing much more sophisticated things. I wonder, and this is my personal opinion, whether the distinction between first and third party behaviors is any longer really relevant, and whether the kind of enormous data sets that are generated, collected, and identified by any party, first or third, need to be rethought about.
So I'll follow up with this. Oh, sorry.
So I just want to kind of, as the panel's been very agreeable, I do want to agree with some of what was said. So I agree with Ed that having kind of architecting the system such that there's better transparency into the interactions or the practices is definitely good behavior. As I said, I think earlier, I also think defining essentially tests that we think companies should themselves be running about certain edge cases of practices that we think problematic is also a good practice in terms of identifying these discriminatory practices that Jeannie was talking about. But don't want to forego the kind of all of these approaches of kind of foregone conclusion that data collection itself is not problematic in any context. And I think we still, with regards to focusing just on the use, I think there is some, one might wonder whether the collection itself could be of concern as well. And so before we, and this is a workshop, and I've done discriminatory research myself. I think it's a great area to get people to care about the issue. But there's also, and many regulators and many others have said that just the collection of the information itself might constitute a privacy concern. And I don't want to kind of forego that assumption.
Great. So this was already just touched on in the final pass here, but I wonder if I can ask more explicitly. So this was kind of focused on regulators and other regulatory bodies, but other audiences here, right? I know, so Ashkan in particular, you've been involved in recent work that actually presents this kind of information to users. So I wonder too, who are the different audiences for this kind of measurement work? It's clear that there's an appetite for this among regulators, but who else should we be thinking of as partners, as the right people to share this with?
Right, and so I guess I haven't spoken about it all day, but one of the recent projects I released was a browser extension called FloodWatch, and what that lets consumers do, a lot of the previous plugins have focused on showing consumers the third-party tracking and cookie setting, like Ghostery. I created one that I sold to Evidon called MobileScope for mobile devices, and there's been Mozilla has one called Lightbeam, formerly known as Collusion. FloodWatch is kind of a different approach where it simply allows consumers to see, or users, not even consumers, it's a browser extension that lets you see the ads that are targeted to you, and it simply just records the ads that you receive. And for the users that choose to share their ad traffic with the extension makers, I'm no longer involved with the project because of my next project. But for those that choose to share, consumers can compare what they see, what ads they receive, with what other people like them see. And that it could be other people generally, or say women in a particular region, for those who have disclosed. So you could say, I'm a 40-year-old in Washington, D.C. How are my ads different than other 40-year-olds in D.C. or other 40-year-olds in New York, or women in New York? And kind of let consumers kind of make some of these decisions and bring some of that awareness to consumers themselves, which is, I think, part of the debate. Some people might say it's fine. A lot of the response we got early on was from, with even the bare minimum features, were people being surprised at the volume of ads they receive. I don't think most people realize that when you're looking at a New York Times or the Washington Post, the little bit outside of the content, almost everything else is ads, right? So just recording that ad stream, the flood of ads, is itself kind of an interesting observation for most. And then seeing how your ads differ, I think, is another way to bring people other than regulators and companies and researchers into this debate.
I just wanted to add a pet concern of mine, which is not just receiving different ads or offers, but receiving different news or receiving different information. Because I am really, really troubled by the idea that a search engine is going to predict what I'm interested in. Because I'm interested in lots of things. And I may be interested in one thing one day. And I also don't want to see, that's why that idea of the filter bubble was so compelling to me today. Because I'm afraid that we are all living in filter bubbles and that it's not doing us any good for civil discourse. I know I've strayed, but I think that is a problem.
My filter bubble, I've got the Google News that I read sometimes. My filter bubble is always so disappointing. I'm like, really? Am I reading that many things about the NFL? Like, where's the kind of philosophy? So you're right. This is a big problem.
I think it's important to look beyond ads as the issue here.
That's what I think.
Yes, exactly. I'm seconding Jeannie's point here, that it's important to look beyond ads because if you think about the harms that we worry most about, they're not associated with ads, number one. And I think there's increasing evidence that this issue was never really about ads, that the rhetoric about this issue was about ads because of this argument repeated so often in Washington that we need to collect this data so we can show personalized ads, and we need to show personalized ads because otherwise the internet would collapse. Leaving aside Paul's, I think, very very valid concerns about whether there's really evidence in favor of that proposition, that the internet would collapse if not for these ads. Even setting that aside, I think that the fact that the rhetoric has been about ads has distracted us from some of the issues that we're more worried about. And it's important that the people who are doing measurements in this space also think deeply. It's probably the case that ads are the easiest consequence of this analysis infrastructure to measure because they're visible. But the other consequences that are less direct but go closer to the core values that we have as consumers and citizens, I think, deserve more attention.
I just can't thank you enough. Could this be broadcast, picked up by journalism, and amplified? Because so much of it is happening. And we as social scientists or researchers or average citizens, I don't think have begun to really look at what effects this has on us all. And I'm quite troubled about it. I'm also troubled that there's transparency in targeting and advertisement, but because of First Amendment concerns, there's no transparency when a political ad is being targeted to you because of some belief that, and it may be amplifying a point that is not even important to the politician's plank or views, but you're being sold that politician on the basis of what somebody quite precisely thinks you're interested in.
Yeah. Politicians and political campaigns use this kind of data very aggressively, and we as citizens could push back against that, right? We could ask campaigns and parties to take pledges to be transparent about their use of data, but we don't.
So I think in the remaining time, I'll open it up for questions, and if I can maybe enlist someone for help with the microphone, that'd be great.
I will help with the microphone right after asking my own question. So the point has been brought up a few times today about whether the kind of research that we talked about in the first two panels, especially the second panel, will ever kind of provide the evidence that is highly sought after in policy circles. And I think even though the panelists in the second panel didn't directly address that question, I think they said several things at various points that I think go toward answering that question. And I've kind of been writing those down, and I also had one or two to add to that list. I thought it might be a good idea to sort of compile that in one place so that we can have a discussion about that. And this sort of naturally leads to a question for the policy panelists, which is, recognizing all these limitations, is there a way to sort of meet in the middle? And I'll start with some simple ones, and this list might get a little bit depressing as we go further along because of some of the difficulties and limitations of the kind of evidence that we're producing. And one is, the simplest one perhaps, is the idea of proxies or masking that we've talked about several times. Even if you try to rule out a particular protected class, there could be so many other proxies for it. And then we talked about the difficulty of ascribing intentionality, which may or may not matter, I guess, depending on whether we're looking at a disparate treatment or impact, as I understand it. And then I want to point to a little bit more complex difficulties. So in the second panel, we talked a lot about this idea of what we can call black box testing, where you control the inputs and observe the outputs, and then there is a big black box in the middle. And what might not be obvious is that that big box could be composed of multiple different parties. And really, the big chart that I showed up in the first session that's been referred to a few times all goes into that box. And Paul brought up the point that you guys are surely smart enough to figure out which part of the box is causing a particular kind of personalization or discrimination, but actually we're not. You know, we're getting there, but it's a very long and slow process. So at this point, I don't think we're very good at pinning a certain behavior on a certain party when you've got this big, messy, interacting ecosystem. Another point that was brought up several times is that you have this really tricky statistical problem. You have a choice between two things. One is either doing randomized controlled experiments, in which case somebody could object that it's not about realistic users, or you could do a crowdsourced study with real data, in which case somebody could object that it's not randomized and controlled. Right. So I want to add just a couple more things to that list. And one is that Ed brought up this idea that when his experience and in general, regulators can download the tools that or enforcement agencies can download the tools that academics make available and run them. And I think that's great for things like online tracking. It gets a lot trickier when you're talking about these sort of experiments that need to statistically ascribe causality. And I think a better mental model for thinking about that might be drug testing as opposed to testing of online tracking, because you get into those same issues of statistics. And if you're talking about how the FDA does drug testing, that's not a model we want to get into. The difficulty of that is not something we want to reproduce here. So I don't know if there's something in the middle where you can do equally complex statistical tests but not have a multi-year process to test a single drug because of complex interactions between multiple drugs and so on. So one last thing I want to add to that is if you look at some of the exciting things in Silicon Valley, it's these agents that sit in our phone and know everything about us. I'm talking about things like Google Now and Siri, et cetera. And so these are not systems that involve a single type of behavior that you can test with input-output. It learns your behavior, over a period of years, over your entire lifetime or use of that device. And then you're talking about what if these systems start to personalize their experience that they give to you? How do you test the effects that might come out of that? I don't think we've even begun to formulate those questions, let alone answer them. And so I leave all these tricky things for your consideration. And I don't think, not to provide answers, but to see if there is any way to sort of meet in the middle or depart a little bit from the conventional approaches that policymaking and regulation has taken.
I mean, I'll start because I think you have two types of things in that list, at least. So the first two really came out of the rich discussion with David and so on in the Q&A. And I think they speak, and you need to be clear about this, and you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, they speak to the law as it exists today, right? The particular vagaries of Title VII, or maybe more broadly speaking, the traditions of the civil rights community and what they think about. I think we're ready as a society to have a broader discussion about how should we define discrimination in the 21st century, and it may have nothing to do with the causality versus correlation debate, and it may have nothing to do with intentionality, and it may have everything to do with kind of figuring out who has power and wealth and who doesn't, right? And so don't be too cowed by that conversation into thinking this has nothing to do with discrimination. It has everything to do with like a new form of discrimination. So that's what the second set is much more about kind of processes, procedures, truth, rigor, all of that stuff that I think is aside. But when it comes to those first two, I want to make it clear that's only true if we're talking about particular lawsuits under a particular law. We can change the law. We've done it before, and I feel like that's where this debate is headed, not necessarily just to Title VII.
Yeah, I'll talk about the second set too. So speaking on the great point about kind of statistical verification and FDA, I've had the fortune of working both at the FTC in the past as well as with a lot of great journalists, including Julia. And for example, the research we found for Staples, we found, again, Staples was a pure black box. Statistically, based on your zip code, they would charge different prices for things, some high probability of the time. So some places they would charge 80%, so we would run 1,000 iterations, and 80% of those would result in one particular outcome or some normative kind of distribution over time. But I had the great benefit of once we had enough to go on, and this kind of goes to Ed's point about how a lot of the regulators kind of, if it's enough to go on, then they can call the company, and if it's the press, they can get a quote on the record. And often, if you're a large outlet, people have a hard time, not impossible, but a hard time lying to large outlets. And if you're the FTC or some other kind of regulatory body, you have the power of subpoenas. You can subpoena source code. You can actually have them run the same tests. So that's been one kind of great kind of way to address this, which is you can get close enough. Good enough for
the start of government work.
And then go the distance for the proof. And the proof part is definitely harder, but there you can find harder factual evidence there. And with regards to the second point about kind of the longitudinal profiling and the kind of the signed in, and the signed in stuff, it's kind of quite good, right? So a lot of the signed in stuff has pretty great features about fraud detection and abuse and all this kind of stuff, and that's part of the reason why we the Wall Street Journal research was crawler based, kind of similar to what you saw here, where we would create profiles run web browsers that would act like those profiles and then check for prices on, say, staple sites. But they were not real people. They were initially me browsing a particular way, but then past that point, they were a bot, they were a machine. The kind of FloodWatch extension, part of the thinking was precisely to tackle this, which is to tackle logged in users when they're logged into services, and and most people, if they use Facebook or Google, often remain logged in, and how to actually measure that kind of perspective of the real user, and we're trying to do that by crowdsourcing, because I think machine-based reproduction of that is difficult.
Could I just make 2 points? One, we're talking about civil rights jurisprudence, but there's a much more flexible statute that everyone up here is familiar with, and that's the FTC's broad Section 5 jurisdiction over unfair or deceptive practices. That is, I think, perhaps broad enough if the FTC chooses and evidence is good enough to demonstrate that a result is truly unfair to a protected class, and that it has to do with a traditionally category that is protected, that action could be taken. I don't know, and I'm not trying to put ideas into regulators' heads, not really. But it is something.
Well, I'd imagine not even protected class.
Yeah.
So if it's unfair based on class separation, right, based on wealth, which isn't traditionally protected, that might be something. So the FTC has a series of actions they call the last dollar scams, where they go especially after people who are defrauding the poor and the elderly. So that could be, I would love to see the FTC get a really aggressive interpretation of unfairness.
What I think, though, you have to be really careful about, and I hope we will be, is that kind of unfairness we can all agree on.
Sure.
Where I can just tell you the advertising community starts to have heart attacks is the idea that you couldn't target a Tesla to a particular group of people and offer them a test drive based on their income level. Now, I have to say, let's again go to the serious misuses. Let's look at things like preying on vulnerable populations. We know that goes on. We need to figure out how to find those who are sending this information and those lead generators who are using it, and bring some actions.
Let me say a couple things about this. First, that based on the speakers earlier in the day who were talking about the state of the art in measurement, it's clear that we're now at the point where we can start to say things like, we know that there's a correlation or causation between gender, sexual orientation, medical status, and so on, and certain kinds of outcomes that in a way that troubles us. But we're not generally in a position to say that, well, we have evidence that company X broke the law, or we have even that we have evidence that a particular actor acted in a way that we would think is morally questionable. And so we can know whether there is something going on that we should worry about, but we're not yet in the position to bring down the hammer on someone for misbehaving. But that doesn't mean that we can't go to a company that is sitting in a powerful situation and have a good faith conversation saying, look, this thing is happening, and that we don't like and we think you probably wouldn't like. And here's a change you can make in good faith that isn't going to have much business impact, but would actually make this thing stop happening or make it happen less. So I think we need to think beyond an enforcement mindset here and talk about a conversation we can have that will help to move us in the right direction. The other thing I would say is that the more visibility we get into these things, and the more it looks to users like they're being treated differentially in ways that they don't like, the more this looks to users like a strategy game, in which they want to use or hire services or tools that make them look differently than they actually are, right? I might make use of a tool that makes me look like a person who cares a lot about the price of things, who's not willing to pay that extra marginal dollar because I think I'll get a better price offer. Just as people do in certain commercial situations today. The more people think that it's a strategy game of trying to look like a hard bargainer, the more they will take steps to make themselves look that way. And it becomes a strategy game. So it's not clear that these techniques to try to classify users will actually be effective if the stakes continue going up.
Thanks. I had one question that was actually kind of related to your point. One thing that strikes me today is that we could also use a conversation with the industry that is actually doing some of this targeting, some of this personalization and this profiling. And I was also just as a suggestion, some of this problem also was raised in the past. For instance, with net neutrality, that was sort of a very important thing for the FCC that was to be enforced. And actually, in this situation, you can you can use fire to combat fire. So typically, the Measurement Lab is an initiative made by Google and a bunch of researchers. And you really well understand why it happens is because there's a company like Google who have some interest in not having net neutrality being violated. Can we use this? Can we use some companies to do that? I know there's an initiative in Europe, the Data Transparency Lab, that is started by some network operators. And I'd like your view on that.
I mean, it goes to my earlier speculation that treating this as a monolithic thing may not be the right. I was involved enough in the do not track debates to know that the publishers don't always see eye to eye with the advertisers, and Ed's already pointed. That's a little understatement. And as Ed has already pointed out, they're a little skeptical and wish they had more transparency too. You're absolutely right. As a political matter, if you want to have more clout, aligning yourselves with one moneyed interest against another is probably the way to do it. And so yes, going to a company saying we can help you develop the tool that'll help you figure out what's happening with your advertising dollars is probably a pretty good way to at least get more resources to do the kind of research, right? I imagine. I mean, hopefully it's done in a way that you can then publish the results to the world and not just develop something proprietary.
Is that something that the FCC or anybody would like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I know about the FCC's efforts too that you're talking about. It's an interesting thought experiment to think about whether the FTC could work with publishers, for example. That might be a little politically fraught. There's no reason they can't, but I don't know if they're going to be willing to embrace all of that.
Network provider is an obvious example because they are very regulated.
Yeah.
And they also, as being just a big provider, they lose a lot of money. So
Yeah.
there's some interest in stopping some of the providers sometimes.
There's a tremendous interest on the part of the advertising industry in preventing click fraud, because that's how people get paid. Also in protecting what was referred to as getting rid of bad ads. That is, ads that have malware. There's also a growing concern about really bad downloads of toolbars that are quite destructive and that are also doing things like key logging, and people get coupon offers and then this stuff comes down. That's what I know about. How that would translate into things that would be of general interest and help the situations we're talking about, I don't know.
Those things.
Yeah, please, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Okay.
It's very differential.
I was not best.
People are so polite, it's wonderful in there. I'm more concerned about the latter things you talked about, Ms. Barton. the criminal things on the internet. Advertising pre-internet has always been selective. GQ magazine, you have ads for fancy clothing for men. Women's magazines, you have ads targeting baby paraphernalia. On the black entertainment television network, you're going to have things targeting African Americans, and advertisers want to target as tightly focused as possible. So I think there's always going to be tremendous pressures to do that on the internet because you just can't afford to over-target. So, but I am really concerned about things like, all the toolbars. I happen to be a computer scientist, so I do know, but my friends, they wind up, one of my friends just wound up with about 800 little virus instances on her computer, and she's a English graduate of Princeton University, a very brilliant person, but has become a victim to this sort of thing.
That's why I switched from English to...
But just to answer your question quickly, so the type of targeting you just described with, African American ads on like BET and other, those are what are known as contextual ads, in the sense that there's an idea, there's a general understanding that there is a particular audience or particular content on a TV channel or a web page. So an automobile blog will have automobile readers. And so we're going to target to those people. And those are known as contextual ads. The difference I think we're drawing is around behavioral ads, which aren't specific to the page content, but are specific to you. And to do that, they would have to infer what are your behaviors and what are attributes that are specific to you. And that's, I think, where the privacy concern is more focused on. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
So I wanted to ask Paul maybe. So you made a great point about the black box, right? This is what we can do now. We treat it as a black box, and we gather some correlations. But I agree with you that it's a big problem because it's a big black box. And one idea, because you mentioned something like there is mistrust between each individual party within that black box. And I wonder what you think, about an idea of leveraging that mistrust, to build tools. For example, if they need tools to audit what's happening on the other boxes, adjacent to them, maybe we could leverage some, their mistrust, right, and gather data through these tools, to build a little bit of
absolutely. I mean, I think Ed was suggesting there's some of that in industry already, but researchers probably have techniques that they're not using in industry. And no, I mean, I've talked to advertisers and publishers alike who have said, the one thing we can tell you is we're making a lot less money or getting a lot less value than we used to, and it's going all somewhere to the black box, and they keep telling us that it's better, but we're not sure. So yes, my guess is there probably is a market out there, and it's probably being filled by someone, but those someones may not be as good as you guys are at what you're doing.
And one of the challenges, too, both to Jeannie's point earlier about preventing click fraud or malware, as well as for this measurement. Typically, all of these techniques for detecting click fraud or kind of measurement of untrusting parties, right? So a lot of the work is, I don't believe you're counting my impressions correctly, so I'm going to add another tracker to make sure that I'm counting my trackers, and you add a second tracker to verify my tracker, and like all of a sudden there's 15 assets on the page that are tracking it, right? So in all of these techniques, both for click fraud and for verification, essentially add more privacy invasive features on the end of consumers. That's the problem.
So in general, I think there are some real research opportunities related to connecting to the ecosystem in different non-traditional places and seeing what you can do from that vantage point, for sure.
So I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I think there'll be opportunities once we adjourn to speak, and please, people who have further questions, come and talk with the panelists. But I just want to thank everyone, especially the panelists who traveled to be here today. I thought it was a great day. I also want to thank the staff of the CITP that helped put this together and arrange for the travel and accommodations for the panelists. And thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And please do stick around and chat with us further.